Okay, great. I'll get right into it. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Cunha. I am the Director of Student Housing and Residence Life here at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We are on our second move-in day. So welcome to UTM. Welcome to residence. I'm going to give you an overview of our residence system here at UTM, some common things that happen to students in residence, questions that we typically get from families, and I'm going to hold some time at the end to answer any specific questions, okay? I also want to mention that the person who comes after me is Veronica Vasquez, who's from the International Education Center. So if you have questions about specific things with international students that don't relate to residents, like accessing healthcare or registrarial things, stuff like that, that's going to go to her, but I'll try my best to answer any questions, okay? First of all, I want to thank you. Yesterday, we moved in 700 residents to our campus. We welcomed 700 residents home to UTM. Today, we're anticipating another 700 or so to move in. So we want to thank you for your patience. We know that we do have some lines, but we try to get as many of our staff there to help you and welcome you to residence and to U of T. This is an important milestone. If you ever lived in residence, perhaps you might remember your move-in day and what it felt like. So we really want to make that day special for your students. Before we start, I usually like to ask families where they come from. I like to know who came the furthest and then who traveled the least. So typically we get like someone from Southeast Asia, or maybe Australia, that's probably as far as we can go, the Pacific Islands there. And then as close as sometimes Mississauga, sometimes Oakville, sometimes down the street. But I want to hear where you're from. Who traveled on a plane to get here? And where did you come from? In the back. Yes. The Philippines. Welcome. Amazing. Over here. The UK. Welcome. Hi. The Congo. Lagos, Nigeria. Indonesia. Brazil. Mexico. Czech Republic. Indonesia. Scotland. Armenia. Who didn't drive? Who woke up this morning and just took a 15-minute drive here? Anybody? Where'd you come from? Toronto. Yes.
So I live about 15 minutes walk up.
A 15-minute walk. I think that's the closest I've ever heard. Congratulations. Great. So one of the reasons I do this is because it's fun, but also it gives you a sense of the type of people that live in residence. You'll see we went all over the world just in here. So we have an incredibly diverse student population in residence that we're really, really proud of. And we work really, really hard to make sure that our students have a sense of belonging in our community and in residence. I'm going to talk a little bit about community as well. One of the main aspects, and I think one of the differences between living on campus versus living off campus, is the community and the support systems that students get. So in residence here at UTM, we are not just buildings. We have about 550,000 square feet of housing on campus. All of our residence buildings are owned and operated by U of T staff, including myself and my 100 staff that all work in residence at U of T. We're not just buildings, we are a community. We recognize the student population that's living with us. These students often are the first time ever living away from home. Sometimes it's their first time in Canada. Sometimes they come without knowing how to do dishes or laundry. That was your responsibility, but now we're gonna take that and help them get there. But we really recognize this is a community, and we know that our students take from the community, but they're also expected to give back to the community. And so what we do when we build a community here is that we build a foundation for our students to thrive in university. University can be difficult. Doing it alone is really, really difficult. But your students don't have to be alone because they live in residence and there's a community there. Some statistics on UTM residents. University of Toronto has many different residence systems. UTM St. George has about 9 different residence systems, and then Scarborough. But I'm only talking about UTM on this campus, at the Mississauga campus. We have about 1,500 undergraduate students that live on campus, predominantly first year, although we have about 350 upper year student spaces in residence. We have 95 resident student staff. So those are all students who are enrolled at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, who also work and live in in all residence buildings. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about them a little bit later. We also have families and graduate students and med students who live on campus. Although it's a small population, we do house those individuals. So these are folks who have dependents. So perhaps they're going back to school, maybe they're getting their PhD, but they live with their partner and with their children here on campus. And lastly, we have 6 of our professional staff who live on campus. Not all of my staff live on campus, but 6 of them do, and they participate in an on-call rotation. So I want you to know that when your child or your student is living with us on campus, there is always professional staff on call, available, and ready to help, including some of the services on campus like campus safety, which I'll mention later. I also want to highlight the benefits of residence. So the residence has been researched and studied on the effects of the student life cycle and the success of students. We ran a study with a few different universities in Ontario a few years ago, where we researched the students who lived in residence versus the students who didn't live in residence, and the likelihood they were to persist to second year, and the likelihood that they were to persist to graduation. So I want to share some of those results with you. Students in residence are more likely to participate in extracurricular activities on campus. They report more positive perceptions of campus life. They're more satisfied with their university experience in general. They report more growth and personal development. They engage in more interactions with peers and faculty, and they're more likely to persist to graduation. That doesn't mean that people who live off campus don't experience this. This is just generally speaking when we did a study on our students living in residence versus off. And I think that all of this comes from community. It doesn't come from necessarily the buildings they live in. It's the people that they meet and the support systems that we have in residence. Transitioning to university can feel very different for many people. However, in residence, what our job is to do is for students to move in and move through. So they live with us for typically the first year. We do not have space on campus, unfortunately, to house students for 4 years. A lot of upper year students do apply to live on residence, but it is pretty competitive. And then we work to move them out. So we have 8 months with them where we have to teach them how to transition to university, perhaps how to do laundry, how to wash dishes, how to manage a conflict on their own, how to take notes. These are the things that we teach them. And then when we get closer to move out, we teach them, now you need to move out and live on your own, or you need to find off-campus housing. And we help them do that many different ways. Sometimes we have workshops where they can meet roommates. We have workshops on how to look for signs of bad landlords. These are the kinds of things that we help them with. So we really want to take these 8 months, transition them so that they can be more successful independently moving forward. And then transitions are influenced by the situation, self, support, and strategies. And support is really, really where we come in. This is why we have so much staff living in residence. If we had 550,000 square feet of privately run housing, I will tell you right now that privately run housing would never spend as much money on support and staff as we do. But we do it because we're from U of T, we work for U of T, and we're a nonprofit. We don't try to make money off the students. We give everything right back in support and in staff because we know our students need it. I also want to just highlight one of the really important parts that we want your students to attend is our events. If your student moved in yesterday, they would have attended their first community meetup, and that's really essential that they go to that meeting. And that meeting is with their residence Dawn, where they can get the basics of, okay, where do I go next? What's the next week look like for me? How do I use my card to get into my room? Where do I do laundry? Where does that work? It's this first orientation, that setup of building that community. And then throughout the week, we have an incredible amount of orientation events and opportunities for them to meet one another. Sometimes that can be a little bit scary, but we really encourage our students to go together. So they can go with their residence Dawn, maybe they go with their roommate, but we really want to encourage your students to go to these events because they're not just fun, they're also really important to transition into university life. These are some things to consider for parents and families, some things to think about. Perhaps you already knew about this. Perhaps this is new. But they are leaving home for a new home. When you came here, my staff might have said welcome home because we really want to make sure that your students feel like this is their second home. Their first home, of course, is with you, but this is not just a transition time for them. We really want them to feel like this is their home. Something that can be a new challenge for your students is managing freedom. I want you to think back when you were perhaps the first time you moved out of your home with your mom and dad or your family and what that felt like, the access to freedom. That's something that they have to manage. They have to manage having someone not go to them and say, hey, are you going to class? Or wake them up in the morning. We've had parents who come to us and say, you know, my student has a really tough time waking up in the morning. Can you send staff to make sure they go to their class? The answer is no, we can't do that because they're an adult and they should learn how to do that on their own. If we do that for them, how are they going to learn how to do that on their own, right? So managing freedom is something that a lot of students go through and something you should be thinking about when you're talking to your students when they move here. Another trend that happens is changing relationships with friends and families. Sometimes our students move into residence or move into university thinking that they're going to keep all the same friends and all of their relationships are going to be the same. That could happen, but typically it doesn't. Typically they come and they meet new people, they make new friends. So that's something to expect. You might hear from your students saying, well, I'm meeting new friends, or I haven't really kept in touch with my high school friends anymore. That can be pretty common. I just want to highlight that that's something that happens. A change in frequency of interactions. Perhaps you and your student talk on the phone every day, or you see each other every day, or the expectation is that they're going to call you every day. I want you to make that expectation clear to them because we always have students who forget, and it's not because they don't love you, it's not because they don't think about you, it's because they're so busy with all these things that are happening at university. So you should tell them now, say, I expect you to text me every day, tell me how your day was. Tell them that now. Because the frequency of their interactions might change. And I promise it's probably not something personal. It's just that they're managing their freedom. There's so much going on. Everything's exciting and they forget to text mom and say, hey, I'm doing okay. Academics will be more demanding. The University of Toronto is consistently ranked the #1 university in Canada. It's consistently ranked the top 20 public universities in the world. That also comes with some work, right, and some demanding programs. So a lot of our students are the top of their class, and they come and then they become average in their class, and that can be really challenging for them to navigate. So I want you to know that that's something that happens often, so you can be prepared. So if they do get their first midterm back and they're used to getting 90s or A pluses and they got a B, and that's going to be really challenging for them, that's pretty common. So I want you to know that might be coming. Time and stress management. Again, back to that freedom. One thing that comes with freedom is you have to manage your time. And you don't have someone making your food for you, and you don't have someone doing your laundry for you. So that can be kind of stressful. We help your students through that, but I want you to know that that's a common thing that students go through. And lastly, meeting people with different identities. Maybe your student is coming from a space where the population is pretty homogenous, where most people are kind of from the same community or see the world in the same way. That's not how it is here. Here, as I did an example, where are you all from? You saw all the amazing countries that you're all from. We have students of every identity, students of different gender expressions. So we want you to know that this is a diverse community, but at the same time, like you're giving back to the community, we want to make sure that every student feels a sense of belonging and this is their home. So your student might be meeting someone who maybe sees the world in a very different way that they've never experienced. But that's a really good thing. It's really part of the university discourse and understanding how a global university comes together and builds community. Wanted to show you a picture of the amazing staff that I have in residence. All together, we have about 101 staff. Most of our staff are student staff. And the reason we have student staff in residence is because research shows that students are far more likely to confide or look for support from someone who's a peer versus someone who's a professor or significantly older than them. So if we, in our residence system, took out all of our student staff and we just had professional people, people my age or older living in residence, we don't think we'd have the same community feeling with our students. So all of our students who live in residence are current students and they're upper year students. So we find that really, really works. Students are far more comfortable to talk to someone who's a year older who did the same thing last year than they are to some guy like me. So our resident staff, we have sort of many different positions. I'm not going to talk about the specific positions, but I'll talk about the categories of people. We have professional staff. We have about 20 professional staff members, many of them with advanced degrees, master's degrees in education, in community development, in adult education. And we have folks who work in facilities. We have folks who work customer service, who work operations, who work in curriculum. And so those are our professional staff. These are professional staff members who work at U of T, 6 of them who live on campus, which is our next one. 6 of our staff live on campus in residence amongst our resident students and participate in an on-call program so that we have professional staff available within like a 10-minute reaction time to our students. We also have residence dons, and perhaps that's a pretty Canadian British term, a residence don. You might have heard of an RA, or a residence assistant, is often used in the United States. And these are upper year students who live in the communities with your students. So every one of our students who live in residence has a residence don, and this residence don is really a generalist. They're a generalist in support with mental health. They're a generalist in support with resources. They're really the first person you want to go to when you have an issue. So if your student calls you and says, I'm really having an issue with really whatever it is. I'm having an issue with my roommate. I'm having an issue taking notes. I'm having an issue, whatever it may be, you should say, well, did you talk to your residence, Don? That's probably something you want to do. Go walk down the hall, knock on their door and say, hey, I need some help doing this. We train our resident student staff intensively for 2 full weeks on everything from emergency response to conflict mediation to mental health first aid. They are really, really well trained. And also, to be a residence don on this campus is really, really competitive. We often have hundreds and hundreds of applications of people who want to work in residence. So we are really proud of the caliber of our residence dons here at UTM, and we take that job really seriously. Additionally, we have other student staff positions like our resident service assistants who work at the Oscar Peterson front desk. And that front desk operates very similar to many front desks that you might be familiar with, like a hotel, there for support, general questions, administration things, that's all at the front desk. And that desk is open typically from, I think it's 8:30 to midnight every day. So really accessible to our students. The other part of our residence operation in our residence life operation is our residence education. So we have 2 different positions there. One, we're our residence education facilitators, and those are individuals who do academic programming. They live in residence, they live amongst the communities, and they do academic programming for our students. And those are upper year students as well. And lastly, we have our living learning program facilitators. And we have specific communities that are geared towards specific courses. And those are called living learning communities. Your student might live in one of those, and so they'd be assigned a living learning program facilitator. That's not in every community. It's only specific communities that have that extra program. For resident support, of course, residence dons are your first go-to. We have on-call staff. The residence dons participate in an on-call rotation. So every building, every area of building has on-call staff. So if your student is locked out or needs something, there's an emergency, first responder is going to be the residence don on call. Typically that response time is within 10 minutes. We also have another tier which goes to our senior staff, another tier which goes to professional staff, and then another tier that goes up to me as a senior level of on-call. We also have campus safety on-call for support. So throughout the year, we are always here. Resident service desk, like I mentioned, and I also want to mention that we have trained mental health and crisis professionals in residence, and we have a specialized student support unit within our department. So within our department, we have a unit that takes on specific high-level cases for students. So maybe there's a student who has a really complex issue that we're trying to navigate. Instead of putting them through multiple different folks, we're going to centralize them, and we have 2 professionals who are experts in this area who can help them navigate those issues. I mentioned residence education. So the living learning communities, like I mentioned, those are the ones up on the screen that we have, that students live in. And we also have a residence curriculum. So we are really intentional in student housing, where we have a curriculum very similar to the way a school board would create a curriculum for their students. We have something very similar in residence. So we've built this curriculum over the past 10 years to identify what it is that students need to learn within their first year of residence. And that ranges. And so instead of, so those residents on-site I talked about and having those community meetups, those community meetings in the first meeting, those residents dons just don't show up and say, hey, we're all meeting, I hope things are going well. We have a facilitation guide that they have to go through, and we assess that. We take attendance. We're really, really intentional with the learning that happens in residence. And that's something that you won't see off campus, you won't see anywhere else. That only happens here in residence. With that residence curriculum, we have over 500 community gatherings, and those community gatherings are each community. 145 academic development workshops, 50 large-scale events, and 32 faculty field trips is what we did, I think, last year. So we're really proud of our programming here in residence. Like I mentioned, my department is one of few departments at U of T that operates 365 days a year, 7 days a week, because we are an essential service. Similar to the way food service is an essential service, similar to the way snow clearing is an essential service. So we are here throughout the year. Your students are required to move out during the holiday period. However, if they can move out or they can't go home, they can apply to stay over the break, and we'll accommodate them to stay over the break. We'll still provide them with programming. It's a bit less support, but it's still there. And we don't charge extra for that. That's typically for students who live internationally. Sometimes we have students who live in Toronto who apply to live over the break, and we ask them why, and we typically try not to have people who are close by. It's mostly for international students. I want to highlight FIPA, which is it's the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. And what this is a policy or is a government act where we can only share specific information with specific individuals. The students that are living in residence are all of age to be an adult, and we treat them as adults. So if you were to call our residence desk, for instance, and say, hey, I'm just checking on my son, Brian, can you tell me if you went to class today? Our response, or what I train my staff to say, is we can't confirm that that person lives here because we can't confirm who you are, and we don't give you information. It's up to you to get that information from your student. Similarly, if you call and ask a question about even finances and say, hey, I want to call because I'm not sure about something that showed up on my student's ID, we'll say, well, you have to get your student to come in because we have to talk to them individually. So it's very, very different from high school where you are the guardian and everything goes through you. Now they are an adult, so it goes through them. I just want you to know that. And it's not because we don't want to share that information with you, it's because we're legally bound not to. We often get questions from parents of like, okay, what's that threshold? When will you call me? What if something happens? What if they're in the hospital? That's typically a decision that I make. And typically when we interact, when we bring parents in, is when we're concerned about the safety of your student. So if we're concerned about their safety, then we're probably going to call you. But if they have a roommate conflict and they're upset about that, we're not going to call you to tell you that they have a roommate conflict, okay? So there is a threshold for sure, but the threshold is safety or worried about the safety of your student. Typically, when a student goes to the hospital, for instance, we will ask them, we will tell them, you should call your parents, you should call home. Most people do, so we don't usually fall into that category. If something happens, they're usually in contact with you. But if the student is in the hospital and they're unable to contact their parents because of the situation they're in, then we'll call you and let you know. Off-campus housing, for folks who are new to Canada or just came to Canada, you might not know, but we are in a housing crisis. We still are since the pandemic. It's really, really challenging to find housing in Canada. It's hard to find affordable housing, and it's especially hard to find student housing. Mississauga, as a city, is large enough that it's not a quote-unquote university town. So there's not an abundance of purpose-built student housing here in Mississauga, as there may be in perhaps the suburban environment like Waterloo or London, Ontario. We're a little bit different. If you came into campus today, you would see that we're not surrounded by student housing. On Mississauga Road, those beautiful houses that you passed, that's not student housing. In fact, those people would much rather not have students live on that road. So many of our students live in specific pockets in Mississauga. We help our students transition there in the winter term. So in Canada, if you are a student looking for off-campus housing for the next year, for September, you should be looking in January, February, or March. That's when you should start looking. We have students sometimes who start looking in August, and it's really, really challenging for them to secure something. So in that winter term, that's when we do our programming to find off-campus housing. We teach students who attend our programs about the Residential Tenancy Act, which is an act that holds landlords and tenants accountable. We do roommate matching meetups, things like that, because not every student who lives in our residence in their first year can live in our residence next year. We don't have enough spaces. If you drove on campus, you also probably saw right beside Oscar Peterson Hall, there's a huge construction pit. That's a new residence that's going to be built because we need more housing. However, that's not going to be built for another 2 years. We're trying our fastest to build as much housing as we can on campus. But in the meantime, you should know that most upper year students can't live in residence because unfortunately we don't have enough space for them. One way for them to get in and to live in residence in their upper year is to work with us and to apply to be a residence don, apply to be a student leader. So many of our students who are upper years obviously live with us because they work in residence with us.